quite complex because and the second is quite simple. But the first concerns local government finance. And that's always something that keeps us awake at night. And many of you, I know, will have taken the view that, well, my mind's made up, so please don't confuse me with the facts. Nevertheless, perhaps rather foolishly, just allow me to, perhaps as much as I can, to put a non-political steer on the way the government distributes money to local authorities. On balance, since 2009-10, the funding that has been distributed to local authorities has been distributed in an uneven fashion. There's no dispute about that. Mind you, and if you look now, the latest 2013-14, and I was reading the complaints that are coming from some of the shire counties, I think the pain is actually starting to hurt right across the board. But there are a number of reasons as to why, perhaps a little bit complex, but nevertheless, there are a number of reasons why that we've seen this narrowing of the differential between some of the more affluent areas and some of the more deprived areas. I'll just suggest to you 3 reasons why this narrowing has taken place. Firstly, we go back, and I'm starting in 2009-10. In those wonderful days when Gordon Brown was in number 10, and just before the election, surprise, surprise, yes, he did give quite a number of specific ring-fence grants to local authorities, many of which went to metropolitan boroughs. They were always intended to be only for 1 or 2 years. In fact, he used that wonderful phrase of saying, in future I'm going to give local authorities more opportunity, more choice in how they spend the money, which we know from Eric Pickles is a euphemism for saying, I'm going to cut your funding in future and you can make those hard decisions. So yes, that did happen in 2009-10. And then, secondly, this government, and for my part, I believe absolutely rightly, has encouraged councils to freeze the council tax. Now, council tax is probably the most regressive tax that we have. Apart from the TV licence, if you count the TV licence as tax, council tax is not a progressive tax. It's not a tax that we should welcome any measures to reduce any increase. Unfortunately, or otherwise, if you do try to freeze the council tax, you do have to give more money to those parts of the country that tend to pay more council tax. And thirdly, perhaps I should remind you what Tony Travers told us at the Floral Pavilion. More and more, as the years go by, councils spend a greater proportion of their spending on social services. And social services costs are very often the same right across the country. In fact, we think it's expensive to put somebody into residential care on Merseyside, but the cost of putting somebody into residential care in the south of England is even far greater than it is up here. So all those factors, and there are others, because education has been frozen and that tends to be fairly even across the country, whereas and is less affected by levels of deprivation. All those have contributed to a reduction in the differential. But let's not forget for one moment that even after all that, the 10% most deprived councils in this country will spend something like 75% more per head than the 10% with the lowest spending, most affluent parts of the country. And if you really want to look at it, I know reference was made to the reductions in Hackney, but it still remains the case that the councils that are the most highest spending are the inner London boroughs. And you might just ask, why is that the case? And that brings me to my second part. The second part is, it's quite simple. We need to continue to maintain our dialogue with central government. And we need to do this not so that we can go along with the begging bill, not so that we can go along and tell them that we have got a problem with our finances of 77 million. In fact, I can imagine, I don't know what happened when we went a few weeks ago, but I imagine when we left, they closed the door and they said, whew, golly, we got away with that one. We've only reduced the grant to Wirral by 15 million. They've got a 77 million now. The 77 million problem. We won't get the blame for that. No, that's not the reason we need to maintain the dialogue. We need to maintain the dialogue because of the special circumstances that do affect Wirral. There will be, following initiatives like Michael Heseltine's review of city regions, there will be additional funding coming to Merseyside, and we do need to ensure that we get our share. There is a clear danger, given our geographical position, that we will lose out. We are, after all, the second highest local authority for the number of residents that live in the borough that work outside. Geography dictates that we will remain a place to live, if not to work. So, let's make sure, let's be absolutely practical, that we do get the funding that recognises that position. So, for example, anyone who's thinking of coming to live on the Wirral, drives through the Wallasey Town, pays £1.60, and then has the misfortune to drive up Borough Road, has to pass derelict properties next to the library. We've been talking about demolishing those properties for the last 10 years. Similarly, this council, we heard earlier about Kate Wood, been on the council since it started.
Brighouse,
okay.
You had your time. Did somebody, are you prepared? Okay. Right, carry on.
Similarly, we've been talking about making commuting easier by electrifying the Pittston to Wrexham line for about the last 40 years. So these are the reasons why we need to keep talking to Westminster, the Welsh Assembly, and whatever it takes to make sure that Wirral is not forgotten. So let's be positive about what we're doing, and let's put Wirral on the map. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Any other speakers? Who have we got here? Yes. Your good self first, Councillor Gilchrist. You were first.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've been listening very carefully to what the leader of the council says. He knows that we share many years of interest in trying to work out these financial issues. The first query I have is I don't know what we've got against Dorset, North Dorset. It happens that their total spending power is 7.615 million, which compares to our 321 million. We're actually not comparing like with like as far as I can see at all. I don't know, and I've never been to Milton Keynes, but I reckon I've gone through on the train once. But we look at population pressures and population growth. So I looked at the census for Milton Keynes, and I found that their population had gone up by 36,000 and more since the last census, which was a 17% increase. So inevitably, there will be some changes in their grants. Now, we often look at Wirral's ethnic makeup, but as far as I can see from the census, 18.5% of Milton Keynes residents were born outside the UK. So there are a whole host of factors that might get written into the various calculations. Now, the Bishop of Liverpool has been mentioned courteously by the leader of the council, so I looked at the question that the Bishop asked in the House of Lords on the 23rd of January. He asked for a greater allowance for highest levels of deprivations in both rural and urban areas. There was a comment from Baroness Hannam, I'll come back to, and in particular Lord Harris of Haringey, who I follow, asked particularly, did ministers change the formula for distribution so as to produce a result whereby the most deprived areas are losing the most? That's the key question that was asked. Baroness Hannam says, my lords, the formula has not been, as been suggested, tinkered with. Now, I'm happy to sit down with the leader and other representatives and look at specific things that we can argue our case on behalf of Wirral. I looked at the leader's letter from last November, which set up the meeting with the government. In particular, I'm paraphrasing it, but it said, we don't want to be rewarded for our bad budgets, but there are a number of specific things we want help with, capitalisation being one of them. So I'm quite happy to look at those aspects. But what I do find trouble with is the impression that it would all be different somehow if the government weren't there. And for that evidence, I looked at a recent article by Laura Wilkes, who works for the Local Government Information Unit. And what she said, with the coalition having passed its midway point, councils will be thinking about whether a future Labour government might be able to give local authorities a better deal. Now, she works with an LGRU, and she ought to know what's going on. She says, but we already know that restoring public spending to the levels before the 2010 election is just not possible. There simply isn't the money that there once was. Now, that is the key...
Councillor Gilchrist, your time is up. Councillor Grassman.
Numerous times people have said to me these council meetings are close to meaningless. A lot of noise and bluster, which achieves almost nothing, a bit like Bruce Springsteen's Jungle Land. However, as Mark said, the point is to change it. This motion calls attention to the inequality of the cuts to local authority budgets being imposed on councils with high levels of deprivation, which previous governments have recognised by awarding higher revenue support grants. This government is imposing the biggest cuts on these authorities, thereby ensuring the least able to pay are paying the highest marginal costs to support a government policy driven by the laughable notion we are all in this together and designed to fix a budget situation which has arisen as a result of greedy city bankers and international financiers. Some of you will be aware that a couple of us have visited South Africa recently. Everywhere we went, we saw signs saying not to feed baboons. We wondered why anyone would want to. They looked a bit scary. Once we came upon a sign which said, baboons are dangerous wild animals. Baboons which have been fed by humans become aggressive and have to be destroyed. But what about life from the baboon's perspective? Walking on your knuckles, hunted by dogs. Does a baboon suppose the next baboon is going to steal the food from its mouth, or will it kill it first to save the bother later, and then steal the food? I'd suggest baboons make zero-sum calculations. Humans have the capacity to make more sophisticated distinctions. In 2011, Petra Ecclestone spent £11 million on her wedding. At the time, in answer to criticism her mother said she didn't care how much the wedding had cost. It was a once-in-a-lifetime day. Who cares about money anyway? This is a story from that hotbed of socialism, the Daily Mail. I suppose they think the unto-mention have My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding on telly to console them. At last week's Cabinet, the Director of Adult Social Services reported the proposed increase for the cost of care home provision in the coming budget will be £1,065,000 for the year. In other words, Petra's wedding could have paid for the increase of cost for care for this year for the next 10 years. At last week's area forum, a member of the public asked Tories opposite what they had said on behalf of Wirral's beleaguered population when they met Eric Pickles a couple of weeks ago and the cuts to services they were being asked to accept. They had to admit they hadn't said anything on the subject of unfairness at all. I would ask the humans opposite how they can defend a government that offers tax cuts to millionairesses